The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
The infamous scene that took Fawlty Towers off the air. There is a moment inside one single episode of a British sitcom from 1975 that, decades later, was quietly pulled from a streaming platform overnight. No warning to fans. No press conference. Just gone. It was one of the most beloved comedies ever made, ranked by the British Film Institute as the greatest British television program in history. And yet a handful of seconds inside, it became so radioactive that a broadcaster owned by the BBC yanked the entire episode from its catalog. The man who wrote it called the decision cowardly. Viewers were split down the middle, and the argument over that scene still hasn't fully died down. So what actually happened inside that hotel? And why does one episode of a 12-part comedy from the 1970s still make people uncomfortable today? Let's get into it. To understand why this scene exists at all, you have to go back 5 years before the show ever aired, to a real seaside hotel in Torquay, England, where a very real, very difficult man was about to become the accidental inspiration for one of the most iconic characters in television history. In 1970, the Monty Python team checked into the Gleneagles Hotel while filming location shots for Monty Python's Flying Circus. The man running the place was named Donald Sinclair, and by every account from the people who stayed there, he was almost impossible to deal with. He hurled a guest suitcase over a garden wall because he suspected it might contain a bomb. He scolded a guest for using his cutlery incorrectly. He treated ordinary requests from paying customers as personal insults. Most people who experience a hotel manager like that write an angry review and move on. John Cleese, already a rising star of British comedy, watched Sinclair with something closer to fascination. He couldn't quite believe a real person behaved this way, and that fascination stuck with him. A few years later, Cleese returned to that same hotel with his wife and creative partner at the time, Connie Booth. The visit gave them a shared first-hand account of just how strange and specific Sinclair's behavior was, and together they began shaping it into a scripted character. A permanently stressed, socially graceless hotel owner who was constantly at war with his own guests, his own staff, and his own ambitions. That character became Basil Fawlty, and the hotel became the fictional Fawlty Towers, set in the same coastal region where Sinclair had once ruled his lobby like a nervous general defending a border. Before any of that, though, it's worth understanding what shaped Cleese as a writer in the first place, because the sensibility behind Basil Fawlty didn't come from nowhere. Cleese grew up in Weston-super-Mare, an only child, tall for his age well before he was tall for anything else, and by his teenage years he had already developed a sharp, dry sense of humor that leaned more toward observation than slapstick. He studied at Cambridge, where he initially trained in law, and it was almost by accident that he ended up at the university's famous Footlights Comedy Club, after being asked at a student fair whether he could sing or dance, and answering, essentially, that he couldn't do either, but he could make people laugh. That turned out to be enough. Through Footlights, he met several future collaborators who would go on to shape British comedy for decades. And by the time Monty Python's Flying Circus launched in 1969, Cleese was already known for playing a very specific type of character. Educated, self-important, and one bad moment away from a complete breakdown. Basil Fawlty, in a lot of ways, is that same archetype pushed to its absolute limit. Fawlty Towers premiered on BBC Two in 1975. It ran for exactly 2 series, 6 episodes each, with a 4-year gap between them, for a total of 12 episodes across 1975 and 1979. That's it. 12 episodes, and the show became one of the most quoted, studied, and repeated sitcoms in British broadcasting history. Critics were not immediately convinced. Several early reviews described the show as chaotic or difficult to follow, unable to see past the frantic pacing to the tightly constructed farce underneath. Audiences disagreed almost immediately. They connected with Basil's constant, doomed attempt to appear dignified while everything around him fell apart. And the show's reputation grew steadily through repeats, eventually becoming appointment viewing whenever the BBC aired it again. By the time the BFI ranked British television programs in the year 2000, Fawlty Towers came out on top, ahead of every other show ever broadcast in the country. Now, to the episode at the center of all this. It's called The Germans, and it aired as part of the first series in 1975. The setup finds Basil recovering from a blow to the head, which leaves him dazed, disoriented, and even less capable of controlling himself than usual. A group of German tourists is due to check into the hotel, and Basil, terrified of causing any offense, gives his staff a single blunt instruction. Whatever you do not bring up the war. Naturally, within minutes, he is the one bringing it up over and over, spiraling into an increasingly manic string of references to the Second World War, capped by a physical routine where he marches through the lobby doing an exaggerated impression modeled on Adolf Hitler. It is loud, it is absurd, and it is very clearly the show mocking Basil's own idiocy rather than mocking the German guests, who mostly stand there bewildered while their host completely loses his composure in front of them. For a long time, that goose-stepping scene was the part of the episode people argued about. Some viewers found it a brilliant piece of physical comedy. A man so anxious about giving offense that he offends everyone anyway, which is basically the engine that drives every episode of the show. Other viewers, especially those with direct family connections to the war, found the imagery genuinely upsetting no matter how ridiculous Basil looked doing it. But here's the part that a lot of retellings of this story get wrong, and it's worth being precise about it, because the scene that actually caused the show's biggest real-world controversy wasn't Basil's Hitler impression at all. The scene that caused the real trouble involves a different character entirely. The elderly, doddering Major Gowan, a long-term resident of the hotel, played by Ballard Berkeley. Earlier in the same episode, while reminiscing with Basil about a cricket match, the Major casually uses deeply offensive racist language to describe players from the West Indies and India. It's a brief moment, delivered by a character clearly written as a relic, a man whose outdated attitudes the show is holding up for ridicule rather than approval. But the language itself is real, ugly, and impossible to soften with context once it's actually spoken out loud on screen. For decades, that scene aired largely without major incident, tucked inside an episode people mostly remembered for the war jokes and the goose-stepping. Then, in June of 2020, everything changed very quickly. In the weeks following the death of George Floyd in the United States, broadcasters and streaming platforms around the world began urgently reassessing older comedy content for exactly this kind of material. UKTV, a streaming service owned by BBC Studios, announced that it was temporarily pulling The Germans from its platform entirely. The company's public statement was blunt. The episode contained racial slurs, and they were taking it down while they reviewed it. It wasn't framed as a permanent ban, but in the moment, an episode of one of the most celebrated sitcoms in British history had actually disappeared from where people could watch it. John Cleese did not take the decision quietly. He publicly criticized the BBC's handling of the situation, arguing that the show was never endorsing the Major's views. It was laughing at him, holding him up as a pathetic figure whose prejudice made him look small and foolish rather than powerful. Cleese pointed out that there's a meaningful difference between a show that attacks a bigoted attitude directly and a show that puts that attitude in the mouth of a character the audience is clearly meant to see as an out-of-touch fossil. Plenty of fans agreed with him, arguing that pulling the whole episode punished the joke instead of the bigotry, and that a warning label would have done the job just as well without erasing the episode from circulation. Other viewers and commentators pushed back, arguing that the language itself causes real harm regardless of a narrative intention behind it, and that some critics felt the entire conversation was a distraction from more substantive action the industry could take on diversity and representation. The removal didn't last long. Within about a week, UKTV reversed course and announced the episode would be reinstated, this time with an on-screen warning about offensive language and outdated attitudes attached to the front of it. That's roughly the same approach streaming services like BritBox and Netflix had already been using, adding a short content note before the episode plays rather than editing the scene out or removing the episode altogether. So contrary to how this story sometimes gets told online, The Germans was never permanently banned, and Fawlty Towers as a whole was never taken off the air in any lasting sense. What actually happened is narrower and honestly a little less dramatic than the headline suggested. One platform pulled one episode for about a week during an intense period of industry-wide reassessment, added a disclaimer, and put it back. But that week was enough to spark a genuine national conversation about how far you go in editing or contextualizing comedy that was written for a completely different cultural moment. It's also worth pointing out just how central Don't Mention the War became to British popular culture almost immediately after this episode aired, completely separate from the controversy that would come decades later. The line got quoted constantly, referenced in other shows, and became one of those rare bits of sitcom dialogue that escaped the show entirely and turned into a piece of everyday language. Something people say in totally unrelated situations when they want to avoid an awkward topic. That's part of what makes the 2020 removal feel so strange in hindsight to a lot of longtime fans. The episode wasn't some obscure, forgotten installment. It was arguably the single most famous half-hour the show ever produced, the one most likely to come up if you asked a random person on the street to name a Fawlty Towers moment. Pulling that particular episode, even briefly, felt to many viewers like pulling the show's signature achievement rather than a minor footnote. That conversation is still going on, in different forms, whenever an old sitcom gets rediscovered by a new generation on a streaming platform. Some viewers think adding a warning label is exactly the right balance, letting people make an informed choice about what they're about to watch without erasing the work itself. Others think even a warning label is an overreaction, arguing that audiences have always understood the difference between a show mocking a character's ignorance and a show endorsing it. And a smaller but vocal group thinks certain scenes, regardless of intention, simply shouldn't exist in easily accessible reruns anymore. There isn't a tidy answer here, and honestly, that's probably why the story keeps resurfacing every couple of years, usually presented with a lot more drama than what actually happened. Behind the cameras, the making of Fawlty Towers was its own kind of chaos, just less publicized at the time. Cleese and Connie Booth wrote every episode together, and by the time production began on the second series in 1978 and 1979, the two of them had already divorced. They kept working as writing partners anyway, finishing the final 6 episodes as professional collaborators even after their marriage had ended, which is a genuinely impressive bit of discipline given how personal the material must have felt to write together under those circumstances. Prunella Scales, who played Basil's formidable wife Sybil, later said she based some of the characters' icy composure on real women she'd observed who could silence a room with a single look, a sharp contrast to her own famously warm reputation off-screen. Andrew Sachs, who played the endlessly put-upon waiter Manuel, gave the role everything physically, including a well-documented moment during filming of the frying pan scenes where an early take used a real pan instead of a rubber prop, leaving him with an actual bruise before the production switched to safer equipment. As for what happened to the cast afterward, it's a mix of long, celebrated careers and quiet exits from the spotlight. Cleese went on to co-write and star in A Fish Called Wanda in 1988 and later voiced King Harold in the Shrek franchise, staying a fixture of British and international comedy well into his 80s. Connie Booth largely stepped away from acting after the show ended and built a career as a psychotherapist, choosing a life mostly out of the public eye. Andrew Sachs continued acting for decades, appearing in shows like Coronation Street, before his death in 2016 following a battle with dementia. Prunella Scales continued working in film and television for years afterward, including a well-regarded role in Howard's End, before retiring from acting due to vascular dementia. She passed away peacefully at her London home in October 2025, at the age of 93. With her family noting she had been watching an episode of Fawlty Towers the day before she died. Ballard Berkeley, who played the Major, passed away in 1988, not long after the show wrapped. For years now, there has also been talk of a full revival. John Cleese announced plans to write a new version of the show together with his daughter, Camilla Cleese, moving the setting away from Torquay and into a completely new location, with Basil discovering a long-lost daughter and adjusting, however reluctantly, to a more modern world. The project has been in development for some time, with Cleese making clear he wants it made away from the BBC so he has more creative freedom, And as of now, it remains a work in progress rather than a confirmed, scheduled series, so it's worth treating any specific release date you might see online with some healthy skepticism until it's officially confirmed. It's also worth remembering that Fawlty Towers wasn't the only classic British sitcom pulled into this same reckoning around the same period. Streaming platforms were simultaneously reviewing shows built around blackface sketches or outdated racial caricatures, and several of them were removed permanently rather than reinstated with a warning. Seen against that wider backdrop, UK TV's decision to bring the Germans back after a week, rather than leave it off the platform for good, looks less like a one-off overreaction and more like the outcome of a genuine, if rushed, internal debate about where a warning label is enough and where it isn't. That distinction is part of why Fawlty Towers survived this moment relatively intact, while some other archival comedy did not. The show was ultimately judged to be mocking prejudice rather than performing it, even in a scene where the line between the two is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. What keeps pulling people back to Fawlty Towers, and to this particular episode especially, isn't really nostalgia. It's the fact that the show still forces a genuinely uncomfortable question. How do you judge comedy that was written to expose someone's prejudice, when the exact words used to expose it are still capable of causing real pain on their own, completely separate from the writer's intention? There's no version of that question with a clean answer, and Fawlty Towers, almost by accident, became the test case an entire industry ended up wrestling with in public. 12 episodes, one very bad night at a hotel in Turkey, and one scene that more than 50 years later, people are still debating. That's a strange kind of legacy for a sitcom, but it might also be the reason it's never really gone away. So here's the actual question worth asking. Should shows like this be preserved exactly as they were made, warts and all, with context added around them, or is some material better left edited or retired for good? Drop your take in the comments. And if you found this breakdown interesting, stick around, because there's a lot more of British comedy's messiest, funniest history where this came from.